Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're taking a deep dive into something really fascinating, I think, and that is the Poetic Edda.
The Poetic Edda.
Yeah, you shared this amazing collection of poems with me, and it's just mind-blowing to think about, these myths that we've all kind of grown up with, the basis for so many characters and stories, like, from Marvel movies to Wagner to, just all over the place. That these poems, these myths were written down in Iceland, like around 1270 AD, centuries after the Viking Age. Like,
Right.
that's crazy.
It is wild to think about.
And this compilation, especially in manuscripts like the Codex Regius, is like almost all we have of the original Norse myths. Like this is it. This is our window into understanding, these gods like Odin and Thor and Loki and these legendary heroes like Sigurth the Dragon Slayer. And so our mission today, I think, is to kind of go beyond just the stories, and really unpack what these poems reveal about the worldview, the Norse worldview.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the key here, right? We could spend a whole deep dive just talking about the stories themselves because they're so fascinating. Yeah. But it's almost more fascinating, I think, to kind of think about like what do these stories tell us about the people who told them and believed them, know? And it's not just, just fun, fantastical tales of gods and monsters. I mean, these poems offer like a really fascinating, sometimes kind of brutal glimpse into the culture and the values and like the core beliefs that shaped Norse society,
Like I was looking at this and thinking like, wow, this is a society that is so different than, kind of what we think of, in modern times. But so where should we begin to kind of unpack this? Where do we even start?
Well, I think one of the first things that really jumps out at you when you read the Poetic Edda is this kind of pervasive sense of a warlike and aggressive nature.
Yeah, I was noticing that.
Yeah, and it's not just, in the human heroes, it's in the gods themselves.
Yeah, like the gods are warriors.
Yeah, they're not, kind of these benevolent, father figures in the sky, or whatever you might find in some other pantheons. They're out there, they're fighting, they're getting, into brawls and it's wild. So I think, to understand that, I think we have to kind of think about the environment that shaped this.
Right, the context.
Yeah, exactly. So medieval Scandinavia, it wasn't exactly a land of plenty, right? I mean, resources were limited. You've got harsh climate in many places, sparse farmland.
Right.
And so there's this constant struggle for resources, not just about survival, but also about, proving one's strength and ability to provide. And that often, took the form of raiding, right?
Right.
So, going out and taking resources from others.
And that's how you call yourself as a man.
Yeah. Exactly. So it becomes like a cornerstone of male identity, and a prerequisite for social standing. So, that's why even the gods are depicted as warriors. Right. Because they're embodying those essential societal values,
Yeah. It really paints a picture of a really tough world.
Yeah.
Where you had to be...
You got to be tough to survive.
Yeah, and that seems to tie directly into, I think, that sense of toughness, into this intense emphasis on family honor and this almost sacred obligation of revenge.
Oh yeah, revenge is huge in the Poetic Edda.
Like if someone wronged your family, it was like...
I mean, it resonated so deeply with them.
Yeah.
Because in a society where like the family unit was so central, any harm done to one member of the family reflected on the whole kin, right? Right. So the idea of avenging that harm was paramount, to maintaining honor and social standing. But what's particularly striking, I think, and maybe kind of unsettling to us today, is that like vengeance didn't necessarily have to be taken directly on the perpetrator. You know? It could be exacted on any member of the killer's family.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So you can see how this idea of mutual revenge, while it was, maybe intended to kind of bind families together in this feuding world. Right. It also highlights this deep-seated horror associated with harming one's own kin. Because if you kill somebody, you're not just putting yourself at risk; you're putting your whole family at risk.
Right. Yeah. So it's like a deterrent.
Yeah. Exactly. And you can see how easily these cycles of violence could escalate. Right.
Yeah. It's almost a powder keg waiting to go off. It seems like.
Yeah.
Now, alongside this potential for conflict, we also see this immense importance placed on oaths and promises.
Right.
And it seems like these were intended to be like the very foundations holding their society together.
Yeah, that was the ideal, right? The oaths were meant to be kind of the societal glue,
Hmm.
creating trust and obligations in a world where, maybe formal legal structures were less developed.
Right.
But the Edda also reveals how easily these oaths could become sources of conflict or lead to like unintended consequences.
Right.
Think about Loki, for example, right? I mean, he's a constant troublemaker.
Yeah.
He's causing, heartbreak and loss for the gods.
Right.
But he's tolerated in their midst because of an oath that Odin swore.
Yeah. Right.
That he would never drink unless Loki was served too.
Oh, wow.
So it's like this stark illustration of how like the rigid adherence to an oath could sometimes have negative and lasting repercussions. Right?
Yeah, it really makes you question, is the letter of the law always serving the spirit of it?
Exactly.
Yeah, it makes you think.
Yeah, and it really underscores the complexity of their social dynamics.
Yeah.
It wasn't a simple case of might makes, right?
Yeah.
There were all these intricate layers on obligation. Another aspect that's quite evident in the Edda is this rigid class structure.
Yes.
You mentioned Riksula, which kind of lays this out pretty explicitly as a foundational myth. Yeah, so Riksula is a really interesting poem because it tells the story of the god Heimdall fathering the ancestors of the three human classes. So you've got the slaves and peasants, you've got the free men, and then you've got the nobility.
Right.
And the poem kind of details the different expectations for each class in terms of like dress and activities and even diet,
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's very much like, here's how these classes came to be,
Yeah.
and here's how they're supposed to behave.
Right.
But this isn't just confined to Riksula. I mean, throughout the Edda, you see these clear and unquestioned statements about, different social classes. Even the very first lines of Aluspa address, all classes of man, greater and lesser children of Heimdall.
Right.
So it's just matter-of-factly establishing this social stratification right from the start.
Right. It's like built into their understanding of the world.
Yeah, it seems to have been like a deeply ingrained aspect of their understanding of how the world works.
Yeah, it's fascinating how that mythological explanation almost served to reinforce, the social order.
Absolutely, yeah.
Moving on. Let's talk about wisdom and knowledge.
Okay.
Which are clearly highly valued in the Edda.
Oh, yeah.
But their concept of wisdom seems to have been broader than just being intelligent, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
I think what's so fascinating here is that wisdom for the Norse encompassed more than just, intelligence or good judgment.
Right.
It included this deep knowledge of obscure facts, especially about the mythical past.
Right.
And often some form of the ability to see the future, to foresee the future.
Oh, wow.
So when Odin in Havamal speaks of wisdom, he's often talking about intelligent behavior, understanding how to navigate social situations.
Right.
But then you look at a poem like Vathruth Nismal, where Odin's engaging in this contest to see who is wiser.
Right.
And in that context, it's almost entirely about who knows more facts and names about, mythical creatures and events and places.
Right.
So it's like a totally different definition of wisdom.
Yep.
And you see similar kind of definitions at play in poems like Grimnismal and Alvismore. It's like this blend of practical smarts,
Right.
and being a walking encyclopedia of their lore.
So it's almost like survival skills combined with a comprehensive understanding of their history and myths.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah. And it sounds like this pursuit of wisdom, particularly this ability to see what's coming, wasn't always a good thing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, as Odin himself notes in Havamal, having foresight can be a curse.
Right.
Yeah. If you truly know what doom awaits you, it's unlikely to bring you much joy. Right.
No.
There's a sense that sometimes ignorance is bliss.
Yeah.
At least when it comes to the inevitable.
Right.
Which I think resonates even today. Right. Like, how much do we really want to know about the future?
That's a powerful point. And you see this value placed on wisdom and knowledge reflected in how the poems themselves are structured, often interrupting the narrative with these nuggets of lore.
Yeah, that's one of the key characteristics of the Eddic poems that might seem a bit jarring to modern readers.
Right.
The story will be moving along, and then suddenly a character will stop to ask for or impart some piece of wisdom or lore.
Right.
A great example is in Fafnismal, where Sigurth, this legendary dragon slayer, is literally in the middle of slaying the dragon Fafnir.
Right.
And Fafnir is, dying from his wounds, and Sigurd pauses to ask Fafnir about the Norns, these figures who govern fate and childbirth.
Right.
And it's like, what? why are we stopping to talk about this right now?
Right, in this moment.
But it highlights like the immense importance they placed on acquiring this knowledge,
Yeah.
almost as much as the immediate action of the story.
Right.
It's like understanding the underlying forces of the universe was just as crucial as dealing with the present threat.
It's like a constant reminder that there's this deeper level of understanding to be sought.
Exactly.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the literary style of the Poetic Edda. Okay.
It's not just one consistent form, is it?
That's right. Yeah, a lot of people when they first come to the Poetic Edda, they're kind of surprised to find that it's not just, poems as we might think of them. It's not just, rhyming verses or anything like that.
Yeah.
A lot of stories in the Poetic Edda actually switch back and forth between prose and poetry.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so you'll often find a prose introduction that kind of sets the scene.
Right.
And then you get the poetic dialogue and action that follows. And that's the case in poems like Grimnismal and Lokasenna.
Right.
Other poems like Helgakvitha, Hjorvarthsonar, they have the dialogue primarily in verse, but the narration is in prose.
Right.
And some poems even conclude with a brief prose epilogue,
Right.
like Lokasenna.
Yeah.
So it's really this mix that adds a layer of texture to the storytelling.
It does.
It's almost like the important or dramatic moments are kind of elevated through the use of verse.
Right.
So yeah, it's definitely a unique style. And for anyone interested in trying to pronounce some of these these fascinating names,
Right.
the introduction to the translation you shared gives a really helpful primer on Old Norse pronunciation.
Yeah.
Which is not always intuitive for English speakers.
No, it certainly isn't, but it points out some key differences,
Yeah, right.
For example, like that initial H in combinations like HL or HR, that's actually pronounced.
Right.
And the J sounds like Arya.
Right.
The A is the same as in the English thing or this.
Okay.
And the V is generally like Aryif, although sometimes after a consonant it might have sounded more like a W.
Okay.
And then the vowels are largely similar to Spanish. So A is like the O in got, he's like pet and like feet and so on.
Right.
So, it's not exactly the same, but it gives you a sense of how these poems might have sounded originally.
Yeah.
Which I think adds another dimension to appreciating them.
It does. All right, let's delve into some of the major themes that run through the Poetic Edda and look at some specific examples. One theme that seems incredibly prominent, casting a shadow over everything, is this sense of fate and impending doom.
Yes.
Particularly with Ragnarok always looming in the background. It's not a question of if the world will end, but when and how. Right.
That pervasive awareness of inevitable doom is absolutely like a defining characteristic of Norse mythology. And you see it, most prominently in poems like Völuspá, the prophecy of the Seeress.
Right.
Which is entirely centered around this, this prophecy of the end of the world.
Right.
And it's this powerful vision of the final battle. The destruction of the gods and the cosmos, but then followed by renewal.
Right.
So this understanding of a cyclical universe.
Right.
Ending and then beginning again. That's a really fundamental aspect of Norse belief. And, you have to wonder, like, what kind of psychological impact did that have on
it? It had to, right?
If the end is inevitable, how does that shape your present actions?
Right. Does it encourage a certain fatalism, or does it encourage you to, live a heroic life in the face of certain destruction?
Exactly. Yeah, it's a big question.
Yeah. Now, another rich area in the Eddas is the social interactions and the practical advice that's offered, especially in Havamal.
Oh, yeah. Havamal is great.
It's like a survival guide for the Viking Age.
It really is, yeah. Havamal, the sayings of the High One, referring to Odin.
Right.
It's packed with observations about how to navigate the world.
Right.
You find advice on everything from how to behave as a traveler.
Right.
Like, be wise, but not showy. Listen more than you speak when you're in unfamiliar surroundings.
Right.
To the importance of genuine connection with others.
Right.
It cautions against the deceptive nature of appearances.
Yeah.
Noting that somebody who laughs with you isn't necessarily a true friend.
Right.
And a lot of it is like surprisingly insightful advice that still holds up in many ways today.
Yeah. There's some surprisingly cynical, but often very practical advice in there, like the warning not to trust the words of a girl.
Right.
Which definitely reflects the patriarchal society.
Yeah.
But also the laundry list of other unreliable things.
Yeah.
Like a breaking bow or one-night-old ice.
Yeah.
It's like
don't get too comfortable.
Yeah, it's a reminder of like the harsh realities that they faced.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember the cultural context,
Mm-hmm.
when we interpret some of this advice. But even looking beyond that, you see this recurring theme of caution,
Right.
not placing too much trust in things that are inherently unpredictable.
Bro,
It
yeah.
speaks to a world where survival often depended on vigilance
Right.
and a healthy dose of skepticism. It's about understanding the potential for things to go wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's not all just warnings. There's also advice on the value of genuine friendships, how to deal with bad people.
Yeah.
Even practical tips like making sure you have enough provisions when you travel.
Right.
And then, of course, Havamal also delves into Odin's relentless pursuit of wisdom and magic,
Yes.
which is a crucial aspect.
I mean, Odin isn't just a powerful god. He's a seeker of knowledge
Right.
and power. Havamal recounts his sacrifices and trials in pursuit of wisdom, including hanging himself on Yggdrasil, the world tree, for 9 days and nights.
Oh, wow.
And it lists a series of magic spells that he knows, covering everything from healing and dulling weapons to shape-shifting, even raising the dead.
Wow.
So it really highlights this Norse belief in the power of runes and incantations,
Right.
and this idea that knowledge and sacrifice are often intertwined.
Yeah, it's almost like a divine self-help guide at times,
Yeah.
mixed with these glimpses into Odin's mystical abilities.
Right, exactly.
Now let's look at another type of interaction that we see in the Edda, these intense contests of wit,
Right?
perhaps best exemplified by, the battle of knowledge and Vafthrûdnismal.
Yeah, Vafthrûdnismal is a great example of this Norse fascination with knowledge as a form of power.
It is.
So in this poem, Odin, disguised as a traveler, calling himself good advisor,
Right.
challenges this giant riddle weaver to a wisdom contest.
It's like a high-stakes quiz show.
It really is. Yeah, it's like a high-stakes quiz show about the origins of the cosmos and the fates of the gods and other mythological lore.
Right.
And some of the key kind of points that come up in this contest include, the creation of the earth from Ymir's flesh,
Right.
the origin of wind from this giant eagle Hosvelg,
Right.
the complex origins of the god Njorth, who wasn't actually born, the usual way, but among the Vonir gods.
Right.
And so it's not just about, knowing the answers, but also understanding their significance.
Right. And it's not just about reciting facts. There's a real element of one-upmanship, a testing of who possesses the deeper and more accurate understanding of these ancient mysteries.
Yeah, absolutely. And ultimately, Odin reveals his true identity, but unsurprisingly is shown to be the wiser of the two,
Right.
So it kind of reinforces his position as this ultimate seeker of knowledge.
Yeah, it does.
The contest culminates with Odin asking Riddle Weaver a question that only he himself knows the answer to,
Wow.
which is what Odin whispered in the ear of his son Balder before Balder's death.
Wow. So it's this unique, deeply personal piece of knowledge.
Exactly, and that's what really kind of underscores Odin's ultimate superiority and wisdom and wins in the contest.
Wow. That's really clever.
Yeah.
We see this theme of disguise and deception popping up in other poems as well, like in the rather grim tale of Grimnismal.
Yeah, Grimnismal, the sayings of Grimnir follows a similar structure,
Right.
of imparting mythological lore within this frame story that involves Odin in disguise.
Right.
In this case, Odin calls himself Shadowed Face,
Oh, wow.
and he's unjustly held captive and tortured by this King Geiroth. And during his captivity, Odin reveals a vast amount of mythological knowledge to Geiroth's son, Agnar.
Okay.
And it's also in this poem that we get this long list of Odin's many names,
Right.
which really highlights his multifaceted nature and maybe the different aspects of his power and knowledge.
Right.
And this story ends with Geiroth's accidental death when he finally realizes who his captive is.
Oh, wow.
So it's this kind of stark reminder that even kings, can fall victim to divine deception.
Yeah, it seems like knowing someone's true name or having a deeper understanding of their nature held significant power in their worldview.
Rights and knowledge are very closely tied in Norse mythology.
Yeah. Now, not all interactions in the Edda are about wisdom contests or dispensing advice. We also see depictions of love.
Right.
Though it's not always the idealized romance that we might expect, as in the somewhat unsettling story of Skirnir.
Your first Skirnir is a very interesting poem.
Yes.
The Journey of Skirnir. It presents a rather different picture of desire and acquisition, I guess you could say.
Right.
So it tells the story of the god Frey's intense infatuation with this giantess Girth,
Right.
whom he sees from Odin's throne.
Right.
And he sends his messenger Skirnir to persuade Girth to marry him.
Right.
But Skirnir resorts to this series of increasingly menacing threats and curses to achieve this.
Oh, wow.
And while Girth eventually agrees, it's hardly a tale of tender romance. Right?
It's not exactly a meet cute.
Yeah, exactly. It really raises questions about the role of coercion.
Yeah.
And power dynamics and their understanding of relationships.
Yeah, right.
And maybe reflects this more pragmatic view of marriage alliances.
Yeah, it definitely feels more like a forceful negotiation than a courtship, by our standards. Then you have the outright conflict and insults, which are on full display in poems like the petty squabble in Harbarth Sosdoth, and especially the chaotic Lokasenna.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
those are great poems.
They are.
They really offer this fascinating and often humorous glimpse into the relationships, or lack thereof, between the gods. So Harbarth Sosdoth. The Lay of Harbarth is essentially this extended and rather petty, insulting exchange between Thor and this ferryman named Harbarth, who's very likely Odin in disguise.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, just being contrary.
Right.
And they trade boasts and barbs, each trying to belittle the other over these seemingly trivial matters.
Right.
It's almost like divine sibling rivalry.
Yeah.
Taken to this absurd extreme.
Yeah, it's almost like a divine roast battle.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you have Lokasenna.
Lokasenna.
Which takes this to a whole new level of disruptive behavior.
Oh, yeah. Lokasenna is notorious for its no-holds-barred verbal attacks.
It is.
So Loki crashes this feast hosted by Aegir.
Right.
And proceeds to publicly humiliate almost all the gods and goddesses present.
Oh, wow.
Revealing unflattering and often scandalous details about them.
Yeah, no one is safe.
No one is safe from his venomous tongue. He insults Ithin Gifjorn Frigg, Freym Yorth Tyr, and even Sifthor's wife. So it's this chaotic and disrespectful scene that really highlights the tensions and rivalries within the divine community.
Right.
It ultimately leads to Thor's threats and Loki's departure, followed by his eventual capture and punishment.
Right.
For his outrageous behavior. But yeah, it's a wild ride.
It's surprising how much petty bickering and outright hostility there is among these, these powerful beings.
Right.
It makes them feel almost human in their flaws.
Yeah, that's one of the things I think that makes Norse mythology so compelling, is that the gods are not perfect. They have flaws. They make mistakes. They get angry. They get jealous. They're very human in many ways.
Yeah, and then you also get moments of unexpected humor, that cut through the drama, like in the tale of Thrymskitha.
Oh, yeah. Thrymskitha is a great example of the Edda's capacity for unexpected humor.
It is.
It tells the story of Thor's mighty hammer Mjolnir being stolen by this giant Thrym, who demands the beautiful goddess Freyja as his bride in return. And the god's ingenious solution is to disguise the burly Thor as Freyja.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so you've got Thor having to play the part of this demure bride.
Right.
Complete with women's clothes and jewelry, all to get his beloved hammer back.
Right. You can just picture the scene.
Oh, yeah.
It's hilarious.
It's hilarious, the contrast between the fearsome Thor and this ridiculous disguise.
Yeah.
It's genuinely funny, and it offers this welcome moment of levity,
Yeah, it really does. It shows a lighter side to these often serious myths.
Yeah, definitely.
And then you have darker, more complex tales of revenge and an incredible skill, like in the story of Valindarkvitha.
Yes, Valindarkvitha is a very different kind of story.
It is.
It's a grim and compelling story of this incredibly skilled smith, Voland, and his brutal captivity by this king Nithith. And Voland endures horrific cruelty. He's hamstrung to prevent his escape. And in revenge, he crafts these gruesome items from the king's murdered sons.
Wow.
And ultimately escapes by fashioning wings and flying away. So it's this powerful exploration of themes like vengeance and resilience and the abuse of power.
Right.
And it really showcases this idea that even in the face of extreme suffering, the human spirit can find a way to retaliate.
Right. It's a brutal but also strangely triumphant tale of this craftsman using his skills to enact this terrible revenge.
Yeah. It's a very powerful story.
We also see tests of knowledge used in a more strategic, almost manipulative way in Alvismal.
Yes, Alvismal is an interesting one. It features this dwarf, All-Wise, who claims he has been promised Thor's beautiful daughter in marriage.
Okay.
And Thor, none too keen on this match, engages the dwarf in this lengthy question and answer session.
Right.
Quizzing him about the names of various things in different realms.
Okay.
So, like what humans call fire, the gods call it, what giants call it, and so on.
Right.
And it's a display of all wise' extensive knowledge, but it's also this clever stalling tactic by Thor.
Right.
He keeps the dwarf talking until sunrise, and as dwarves in Norse mythology are vulnerable to sunlight.
Yeah.
All wise turns to stone.
Oh, wow.
So it's a demonstration of how knowledge can be both a source of power and a fatal weakness.
Yeah, very interesting. And so knowledge can be a weapon used in unexpected ways.
Yes.
We also get glimpses into the realm of dreams and their prophetic significance, like in Baldur's Drummer.
Yeah, Baldur's Drummer. Baldur's Dreams tells of Odin being deeply troubled by his beloved son. Baldur's ominous dreams, that foretell his own death.
Right.
And in his distress, Odin rides to the underworld to seek the meaning of these dreams from a deceased seeress.
Wow.
And compels her to reveal this dark prophecy of Baldur's demise.
Wow.
So it highlights this Norse belief in the power of dreams as potential warnings of future events, and also the lengths that even the king of the gods, would go to understand fate.
Right. Circling back to social structures, we have Rickstula again, which we touched on earlier.
Right.
But it's worth reiterating its role in providing this mythological basis for their understanding of society.
Yeah, Rickstula really explicitly presents this mythological origin story for the three main social classes.
Right.
So the god Heimdall, under the guise of Rig, travels the world and fathers the ancestors of the thralls, the slaves, the carls, the free farmers, and the jarls, the nobility.
Right.
And each of them, have distinct characteristics and expected roles and behaviors in society.
Right.
So it's this powerful myth that essentially justifies the existing social hierarchy as divinely ordained.
Right. Yeah. It's built into the fabric of their world,
Right.
And while the bulk of the Poetic Edda is thought to have been written down, around 1270,
right,
there are some poems like the shorter Völuspánskamma that are considered to be later additions to the collection.
Yeah, Völuspánskamma, the short prophecy of the seeress, which is found within a larger poem called Hloljoth, is believed to be a later composition.
Okay.
And it blends this genealogy of a human warrior named Otter with mythological information about the gods and their fates. So this intertwining of human ancestry with divine narratives suggests a later evolution or adaptation of the mythological tradition.
Okay, interesting. We also have poems like Gradasanger that tell of more mythical labor and the potential for even magical work to have devastating consequences.
Yeah, Gradasanger, the Song of Gradi, tells this story of these giantesses, Fenja and Menja, who are forced into this relentless labor, grinding out wealth for this greedy King Frothi on a magical millstone named Gradi.
Okay.
And initially, they grind out gold and peace, but eventually, fueled by resentment and, their forced servitude, they grind out war and destruction.
Wow, so it's almost like a cautionary tale.
Yeah, it's a cautionary tale about the abuse of power, and the unintended consequences of exploiting even seemingly limitless resources or labor.
Yeah, and of course the Edda wouldn't be complete without tales of heroes and the powerful Valkyries who often intervened in their lives.
Oh, yeah.
As we see in the various poems dedicated to the hero Helgi.
Right.
Helgvita Jörvar.